This is World to Win, bringing you the latest news and analysis from a socialist perspective.
Hi everyone! Welcome to another episode of World to Win. This is episode 30, very exciting, and of course happy Valentine's Day to everyone. But before we start, I want to remind everyone to subscribe to our channel and also click the bell button so you can be notified whenever we upload a new video or go live. And I want to say hello to my amazing co-host Toya. How are you doing?
Good. How are you, Yara? Happy Valentine's Day. Hope you got some chocolates or some flowers, something like that.
I mean, I'm having the best date of my life right now with you, so, you know.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I will be your Valentine, Yara.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm so excited. But yeah, we are going to talk about something that's less romantic, but we're going to talk about COVID and the developments with it, and especially with the vaccine that's been so much developed in the last few weeks / months, because we haven't talked about it in quite a while actually in this show. So I think it would be good to have an update. But before we do that, there's another thing that I think we need to get updates on, and that's Biden. So can you tell us a little bit about what's happening there?
Yeah, I mean, you know, people were really excited and relieved, as we know, to, get rid of Donald Trump, right? He completely divided the country, and we talked a lot on the show about Trump. But now that Biden is president, people have, sighed this huge breath of relief. But he's already backpedaling on some of his promises. It's absolutely ridiculous. And I mean, the first one is the stimulus checks. So, I mean, Trump gave us a $1,200 check and a $600 check. No questions asked. As long as you paid your taxes, supposedly you're not undocumented, unfortunately, you got a stimulus check. But now Biden is backpedaling, and he's talking about having means testing, meaning if you can only receive it if you make less than $50,000 a year, which is absolutely ridiculous, right? Because that's going off of your tax refund from 2019. So if you lost your job in 2020, you could be making less than $50,000, but you still wouldn't receive a stimulus check. These types of, qualifications, if you receive any sort of benefits or payments, through other things, child support, things like that, like there are, there could be an argument that you wouldn't receive your check. It's absolutely ridiculous. And me, as someone who has worked throughout the pandemic, but didn't make 50,000, I will receive the check. So it's bonkers at the way that, Biden is dealing with this question. The question of a $15 minimum wage, this was like a low bar for him to come in and just say, we need a $15 minimum wage for all workers. That isn't happening right away. And, he's talking about that only happening to federal employees, like all of these promises that he gave that he's just not fulfilling. And one that's really, really sad is, the status and question of undocumented children on the border. Even though Trump didn't start the child separation policies and didn't start the, children in cages, he really amped it up. And Biden has come in and there's talks of him building more. They call them, reunification centers or something like that. They're concentration camps is what they are, right? Like, let's be honest. And talking about building more of them, and just these policies of continuing to keep children away from their parents and not allowing people to come into the country is just absolutely ridiculous. And we know with the violence that we see in Central America, that's pushing people out of the country looking for a better life. It's ridiculous that he's not, opening up the doors and implementing policies that's more welcoming to families that are in need. So it's disappointing. It's ridiculous, but we knew this, Yara. We knew this. We had no illusions. We, meaning Socialist Alternative, we had no illusions in Biden.
Yeah, and I think, there's... If it was just not being welcoming to undocumented immigrants, then that's one thing. But actually separating children from their parents, that is on a completely different level. That is something that is just, I think, objectively cruel. I think there's very few people who would think that this is an appropriate measure. And it's just ridiculous that someone who's meant to be a left alternative to Trump, or at least was presented as that during the election, is not even doing anything with that.
Yeah, it's just as president, he has the ability to do these executive orders. And, the first 100 days of the presidency is looked at as like, that's when you come in and you can make all the changes from the previous administration. And he's not taking advantage of that. You know what I'm saying? He's the most powerful man in the world. Let's be honest. I would say besides Jeff Bezos, because he's got all the money, right? And he could come in and make sweeping changes. And that's just not what he's doing. And I know this is what the show is going to be about, but I won't even mention the, disaster that we have going on with the vaccine. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So no spoilers yet.
Yeah, so if we're talking about the vaccine, I wanted to tell you a little bit about kind of the situation in Israel right now, because that is, like, it sounds like, a vaccine paradise. And in many ways, it kind of is. But I think it's important to also talk about the way that it's being done. And also, I think, the challenges that have been happening. So to our viewers who don't know, in Israel now, anyone can get vaccinated. Anyone over the age of 16 can get a vaccine, and Israel has purchased an incredible amount of vaccinations.
Wait a minute. Did you say 60? Anyone over the age of 60? You got to be 75 around here. 75 years old to get the damn vaccine. I'm sorry, that's amazing.
Yeah, and I live in England right now, and here they're saying that they won't start vaccinating the general population in months. And in Israel, all of my friends are already vaccinated. All of my family, everyone I know, some got the second dose as well, are chatting about the side effects, who's got worse side effects than who. It's just ridiculous. I considered flying just to get vaccinated. But then they closed the border. So,
oh my God, I was like, why aren't you on a flight right now?
I know. I had a flight booked for the day because obviously, and I want to talk about that a little bit, because part of the reason why this is all happening is kind of a last attempt from Netanyahu, the Prime Minister, to kind of show that he's doing something with COVID just before our fourth election in 2 years that is happening on the 23rd of March. I had a flight for that day, but it doesn't seem like it's going to happen anymore because finally the borders are closed. I mean, obviously it is in many ways a good decision, but not for me personally. So right now we have a situation where 3.5 million people got the first dose and 2.2 million people got both doses. And, it's a country of 9 million people. So that is insane. Like the estimations, I think, were something like that. When 4 million people are completely vaccinated, had the 2 doses, and especially if out of those 4 million people, 95% are over 50, then the country can basically open up. But we are now getting to a point after there were queues in clinics to get the vaccinations, and people were trying to get in even before they could. We're getting to a point where it's halting a little bit because people just don't want to get vaccinated, especially young people. And, I think it's a problem we see around the world with all the conspiracy theories and the kind of misinformation about the vaccine. And I think it's really important that we talk about this because it's very easy to dismiss those concerns. It's very easy to say, it's just crazy people with tinfoil over their heads trying to avoid the lizard people, but it's not. I think there's quite a lot of genuine concerns. So, there was a poll, a survey done in Israel where out of the people who refused to get vaccinated, 53% said that there's not enough info on the long-term effects of the vaccine, which, I think is a reasonable concern, especially when you think about the next kind of figures, which is that say that 34% said that they don't trust pharmaceutical companies and that's why they don't want to get the vaccine. So that's a huge portion of people who don't want to get vaccinated. They're saying, I don't trust Pfizer to give me something that would be beneficial to me. And then you have 30% that said that they just don't trust the government. So I think you can't dismiss that fact that people aren't just conspiratorial crazies and lunatics. It's people who have, I think, a natural and in many ways reasonable doubts about the establishment that's made them get to this position of incredible poverty, unemployment, and you know, the main groups in the population that aren't getting vaccinated are people who 100% have the right to question all of these institutions. Like the main groups that aren't vaccinated from choice are Palestinians with Israeli citizenship, surprising, Orthodox Jews, they're also the most likely to die from coronavirus, and ex-Soviet immigrants, all of which are extremely discriminated against group in society. You need to consider why we even have those vaccines in Israel to that extent. So Pfizer basically took Israel as kind of like mass testing site as guinea pigs. And I mean, in many ways, that's fair enough. Israel is a very, you know, a relatively developed country that has nationalized health service, which means that there can be mass vaccinations and there is the infrastructure for it. It's also very small, so it's easy to transport the vaccine. But that is not the only reason that Pfizer did it. The other reason is that the Israeli government signed a blanked out agreement, so we don't even know what really is in the agreement, to give out the medical information to Pfizer. So we don't know what exactly is in that in this agreement, but we do know that the information is going to go just to Pfizer. It's not going to go to the medical community. It's not going to go to other companies. It's not going to go to other governments. It's exclusively going to be with Pfizer. And you can't opt out. No one's asking you whether you want your information to be sent out. Now, I think it makes a lot of sense that we want the information from Israel to be available and transparent to everyone around the world to learn from it so we can fight this pandemic. But if you can't opt out, you're not told that this information is going to go out, and it's only going to go out to a private company that is, you know, trying to get more profit rather than to solve a problem, then I think it makes a lot of sense that people are maybe a little suspicious and don't want to get vaccinated that quickly. And when you talk about the occupied West Bank, well, Israel sent, I think, a few thousand doses, especially, like, I think it was particularly for medical staff in the occupied West Bank, but not enough at all for the entirety of the citizens. Of course, Jewish settlers can still get vaccinated. With Gaza, though, the situation is even more complicated because not only does Israel not send vaccines there, but also there's calls from all sorts of like right-wing people who say that Israel shouldn't send any vaccines to Gaza unless Gaza sends back hostages and prisoners to Israel. So it's actually disgusting what's happening there. But, you know, even if there was a miracle in the right-wing government of Israel and they decided to do what is completely medically necessary and make sure that all the citizens across the borders get vaccinated, the infrastructure in both Gaza and the occupied West Bank is so bad that, you know, the vaccine that needs to be kept, I think, in minus 70 degrees, and just there's no way to do it in the long term. There's no way, and these vaccines could just literally not be used because of the poor infrastructure. So it's really ridiculous, even in a country like Israel right now that looks like a relative paradise.
So today we're going to be speaking with Keishia, who's a member of the Socialist Party in Ireland. Hey, Keishia. So glad you could make it on our show today. And also Keely, who's coming back. Thanks for joining us again. She's a member of Socialist Alternative in the US. So us four ladies are just going to get started talking about, you know, the vaccinations, COVID, but also we need to be pointing a way forward. What is it that we can be doing? So I want to start with Keely. You know, we're all hoping that the coronavirus vaccine is the light at the end of the tunnel. You know, people want to be able to do things, go out to bars, hang out with friends, you know. But as we've seen, this process has been shaky at best. One major issue has been the intense race for a vaccine between different pharmaceutical companies and in turn competing countries. So now we have a number of different vaccines that have been approved, and the rollout of those vaccines has been started. But most countries are behind their target in the pace for vaccinations. And there are reports of waste and even doctors giving out vaccines like unauthorized and getting reprimanded for it. But Keely, can you talk a little bit about why there has been so many issues with this process? It doesn't seem like it should be that difficult.
Yeah, I mean, it shouldn't. And the sort of great news of 2020 was that all of a sudden, all of these like revolutionary new vaccines came onto the market. They're using this brand new mRNA technology that is, supposed to basically be cheap to produce and easy to scale up and all of these things. And yet somehow, even despite all this innovation, it's likely that the majority of the world's population won't get vaccinated until 2024. And if you live in a country like Israel, like you guys were talking about earlier, where, a huge amount of the population has gotten their vaccine comparably, it can feel like, oh, well, who cares about the rest of the world, essentially. But as long as the virus is allowed to circulate in any part of the world, the rest of the world is threatened because it can mutate, it can outsmart vaccines, and then it can enter even, borders that have the highest rates of immunization. And so it's in the interests of the capitalist class to get this under control, but using all of their traditional sort of neoliberal approaches isn't enough to get them out of this, because exactly what's hampering our ability to carry out mass immunization is for-profit based competition between big pharmaceutical companies. And so you had, these great new vaccines come onto the market, but then wealthy countries literally cleared the shelves of them. And so what's left is way fewer doses of less effective vaccines to basically be distributed among countries that make up the majority of the world's population.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about like the light at the end of the tunnel, and I think it's becoming almost as much as a cliche as the words like unprecedented and crisis, right? And obviously it's such a huge relief that it could be over. But yeah, it's not that simple, because it's not just the process of developing the vaccine, but then also the production, distribution, and actually administering the vaccine to, 8 billion people. And at each of these stages, the question of who is in control and for what purpose really comes to the fore, because it's actually in this anarchic way, being administered for the purposes of profit and the maintenance of the profit system, and not human lives and health. And even the fact that the vaccines were developed so quickly, which I think is a testament to modern science and our technology and the ingenuity of the best immunologists. But actually, they were all developed so quickly because of the huge amount of public resources poured into pharmaceutical companies, particularly from the US government, the UK government, and other governments around the world. So the US Health Ministry alone committed over $10 billion to vaccine developers. And all of these companies, as well as having direct public funding, also are benefiting from the fundamental research, which is kind of more general scientific exploration that is developed at public universities as well. And yet they stand to profit and make billions, like Pfizer, BioNTech stands to make 15 billion from the profit of their vaccine. And these private companies retain control over the price, the quantity produced, and who they're going to sell it to. So there's this idea that the capitalist system is so efficient and promotes innovation, yet at the same time, they're just reaping the rewards of this system of like corporate welfare rather than providing for the needs of people. And even with the AstraZeneca vaccine, there are huge shortages now, which are having a real impact on the EU. AstraZeneca has reneged on a deal of tens of millions of vaccines to the EU due to these vague manufacturing problems. But the point is that it's actually restricted due to international property laws, that it's only licensed to certain manufacturers. Well, why not take control over factories and produce on a wider scale? Why not employ some of the unemployed workers, many of whom have technical skills, to be producing these vaccines. Yeah, it kind of reminds me of the example from last March in Italy, where there was a shortage of ventilators, and the manufacturer produced them for $11,000, but then volunteers 3D printed a valve that worked the exact same, that cost $1 and saved 10 lives, and yet was threatened with legal action for breach of intellectual property laws. So it's just kind of showing that this intellectual property laws and patents are such a barrier to actual provision for human health.
I think that's a really, really important point, and I really agree with the point that you made at the start of what you said about how how quickly this vaccination got created, even though we were told that it's going to take months longer, is really a testament to the progress of science and to what humanity can do when there's an actual need and when so much money is pushed onto finding this vaccine. But at the same time, think of how far along we could have been if I think there's something like 230 different vaccinations in various stages of production right now. It's not to even mention the technology of the mRNA that was in existence for more than a decade, but wasn't used and wasn't researched properly because there was no actual funding for it. So we could have been in a very different place if we were led by science rather than by patents, like you said, like the motive of profit. And I think it's particularly glaring when you think about how much money was pushed by governments onto the pharmaceutical industry, and how, like you said, they're gonna get profits from it. Like I think AstraZeneca said that they're not gonna profit from the vaccine until the end of the pandemic. But who knows when they'll define the end of the pandemic? They can define it tomorrow if they want to. So it's like they're going to benefit from that. But also we have to talk about the people are always saying in the last few years the data is the most expensive resource that we have. And all these companies are getting mass data from governments now, like what I said about Pfizer before with Israel. But generally, those pharmaceutical companies are getting so much data that is worth billions to them, because they're learning so much from it, but it's exclusive to them. It's not for the benefit of the medical community, which is absolutely ridiculous. Like if we just took away this motive, these different private companies, and worked together, we could have been, obviously we could have been over and done with this ages ago. But it also applies to a lot of other things, not just COVID. And I think the points that I think Keely made at the start about how the vaccine is not a silver bullet. We're still going to have to use the face masks. We're still going to have social distancing, because we don't know enough about the vaccines, whether they prevent if they prevent others being infected by you, even if you got the vaccine, unclear yet. But also, I think one of the main things that we're talking about is the reports that have been going on in the last few weeks, and the last week specifically, about how the AstraZeneca vaccine doesn't have as much effect as we might have thought on the South African variant of the virus. And I think that's something that we're going to see more and more and more, as countries that have less resources to buy the vaccines have mass infections and more variants. So can you tell us more about why these new variants are a problem, Keishia, and kind of explain how the vaccines go into that?
Yeah, well, these mutations are making the virus easier to spread and are becoming better at evading the immune system. So there are particular mutations on what's called the spike protein, which makes it more efficient at gaining access to our cells to replicate. And particularly the South African variant has spread to around 20 countries, as far away as Norway and Japan. And yeah, the AstraZeneca vaccine has been found to be much less effective against the South African variant in preventing mild and moderate disease, but it still is likely to protect against very severe disease. But even that, even that is a huge problem, because once you have COVID, there's a potential for what's called long COVID as well. And there are some of the vaccines that are still, reasonably effective. But the point is that with these mutations, people have the idea that it's a kind of a naturally occurring feature of a natural disaster, but actually remember that the destruction of wild forests and habitats and by industry actually brought us the virus in the first place. So it's the system and a kind of conscious decision to allow the virus to run rampant through the population that has actually led to these mutations to begin with. And I think it does demonstrate a kind of obscene disregard to human life demonstrated by the ruling elites in control of this, that those in neo-colonial countries are in a way expendable. And there's this fortress mentality to protect the advanced capitalist countries, wealthy countries, using the vaccines. The more the virus is transmitted, the more potential there is for adaptations to become new strains, which means it's harder to deal with, it's more resistant to vaccines, it's more transmissible, it's more damaging to health. And in that way, we're just going to be playing catch up with these new variants as they continue to emerge, unless we vaccinate the whole of the world's population. Like a new strain anywhere in the world isn't going to be stopped by administrative boundaries. It's going to pose a threat to health everywhere. And actually, Bloomberg came out with this study saying that at current rates of vaccination, it would take 7 years for each country to have vaccinated 75% of their population, which is roughly what's probably needed for herd immunity. But of course, that's subject to change because these new strains could be more transmissible and could take that idea, blow that idea out of the water. So the idea that capitalist system has this under control is ridiculous because the vaccines exist right now, but some are saying that it could even take 7 years to have protected the world's population.
Thanks, Keishia, for that. So I want to move on a little bit about how the inequalities in society are actually affecting the way that we're able to give out the vaccine to different people across the world. I mean, one thing we've seen is huge racial disparities. For example, in my city, you have to be 75 years old to get the vaccine, but the average Black person in my city doesn't live to be 75 years old. And so you're creating a huge group of people to not be able to get the vaccine. And also, they're making people go to one location to be able to get the vaccine. So people have to travel, especially elderly, have to travel outside of the city or have to take public transportation to like the baseball stadiums. It's just these huge disparities, especially for our most vulnerable populations. But we're also seeing disproportionate impacts on women, especially working mothers, which we've talked about on this show quite extensively. But just this widening gap of between the rich and the poor and access to things like healthcare and the vaccines. But this isn't just happening within countries that have access to the vaccine. We're seeing uneven impacts of the crisis between different countries. And Keely, you alluded to this in your previous response, but can you talk a little bit about what vaccine rollout looked like so far in the neo-colonial world, and how has vaccine nationalism, if you will, played a part in this?
Yeah, I mean, it's been probably one of the most stark indictments of capitalism that I've seen in my politically awakened life. Where, like we've talked about, you've got all of these good vaccines on the market that, like Keishia explained extremely well, were the product of all of this public research and all of this public investment. And then basically the second it hit the market, it functions like a marketplace like anything else under capitalism, where wealthy countries are able to buy up the vast majority of the existing vaccine pool, actually more than enough to inoculate their own populations. And then you have the vast majority of the world's population there was one country, I can't remember where it was in Latin America, that got a shipment of 20 doses. I mean, it's actually insulting, and has life or death consequences. And like Keishia explained, it's in the best interest of the capitalist ruling class to vaccinate everyone the world over rapidly, because that's how, for their interests, they can restart profit making. But the logic of a for-profit system is hampering their ability to restart profit making. It's completely contradictory and terrible. But essentially what you had is when vaccines that, before they were even approved, the wealthy countries bought them up. And so the typical response of the capitalist system is to say, okay, well, let's lean on the nonprofit sector. Let's lean on, international institutions like the World Health Organization, and they can then supplement, the unequal distribution of a vaccine. And so you had the launching of this COVAX program, which is a joint initiative between the World Health Organization and then this alliance called the Gavi Alliance, which is basically a front group for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and is this, coalition of Big Pharma and government institutions. It's a big happy family. But basically, Gavi and the WHO messed up the COVAX program so badly that it's in complete free fall. They had to bring in Citigroup to be financial advisors to try to dig them out of a hole. And that's because, we talk a lot about like tax the rich, take all the, the wealth off the billionaires. But in reality, even doing that is insufficient. And we're seeing that play out with the COVAX program, where the donations of all of these, billionaire philanthropists doesn't even come close to matching the buying power of capitalist powerhouses on the marketplace. And so they don't have enough money to buy up the vaccines that they need to inoculate billions of people in the neo-colonial world. And so it's between a rock and a hard place. And then probably for me, the most frustrating part of all of this is that there's a really, maybe not a simple solution, but there's at least a pretty harmless short-term thing that can be done, which is to waive all of the traditional intellectual property restrictions on the technology, which Keishia went into a little bit. All this new technology is exportable. You could export it to countries around the world that have, certain manufacturing capacity. And if you just give them not only the actual technology, but the know-how, you train people to manufacture these vaccines, we could ramp up manufacturing and distribution of the vaccine rapidly. But, a number of countries appealed to the World Trade Organization to do exactly this. They were like, please just get rid of of all these patent protections. And the WTO, which requires consensus, the US, the EU, and the UK came in and said, nope, patent protections enable them to make a profit, and that's how we got these medicines in the first place. And so they're not, exporting any of the know-how or any of the technological capacity. And so basically you're in a position right now where there's nothing these countries can do to pull, money out of the sky to buy the vaccines. And the COVAX program is falling apart, so they're not able to deliver on this promise. And so basically, it's just all around a really bad situation.
I think an all-around problem is probably the best way to put it, because I think obviously the situation in the neo-colonial world is abysmal. You can't describe it in any other way. As it's also, like you said, it's a contradiction, because it's literally the benefit of every single person on this planet that everyone is vaccinated as quickly as possible. But what is happening is that the system is not allowing for this to happen, even though this will increase profits at the end of the day. So it's just ridiculous. But I think it's also important to notice that it's not just the neo-colonial countries that are suffering from this vaccine nationalism, what was named vaccine nationalism. I think that there was a story in the last few weeks in the kind of Brexit sphere between the UK and the EU. It was just ridiculous to see it unfold. There was the EU that's struggling massively with the vaccines, threatened to prevent the distribution of doses that were produced in the EU to non-member states of the EU. But obviously we have a massive issue, which is the border between the UK and Ireland through Northern Ireland. So in the Brexit deal, there was what was called the Northern Ireland Protocol, which basically tried to maintain the national question there in the best way possible. But the EU basically threatened to invoke that protocol so that they prevent the vaccines going from the EU, from the Republic of Ireland, into the UK, Northern Ireland. And I think that is very clear to everyone that is absolutely ridiculous. It's not just the question of the national question in Ireland that is kind of ramped up because of it, but also it's just objectively, it makes no sense. Objectively, why would we try to prevent vaccines from moving around? Why would we not try to vaccinate as many people as possible wherever is needed, regardless of the borders, regardless of anything like that? And of course the EU had to like go back on that because it made no sense. But at the same time, there's kind of brought up the question of the Northern Ireland Protocol, and kind of, I think, really showed the problems with the Brexit deal, because now the UK is talking about invoking it and creating and basically making that there's this question of where there is going to be a border, if there's going to be a border, and it's just ramping up these national tensions on top of the already confusing like question of coronavirus and the vaccine.
And what we're seeing here is all these countries dealing with it differently, all of these countries creating these different barriers for people to get the vaccine. I mean, even in the US, the different states are dealing with it differently. And so this whole question of, a national healthcare system, Medicare for all, universal healthcare has, really gained traction in the US. Starting with Bernie Sanders, really, if we're honest, he popularized this idea, but the pandemic has shown what is needed. But a lot of people still don't truly understand what universal healthcare is. They look at countries like Canada, or they look at places like the UK, and they hear all this, fear mongering basically, and they don't truly understand what universal healthcare is. I mean, one thing that it could address is, in my state, you have these rules where if a young person brings an older person to get the vaccine, that young person can then get the vaccine. And so people are putting ads on Craigslist telling old people, I will pay you $200 if you let me bring you to the mass vaccination site. Uber drivers are looking to bring people down to, where the New England Patriots play football, to get the vaccines. And things like this wouldn't need to happen. Young people wouldn't have to pimp themselves out to bring people to get the vaccine. Universal healthcare could address these types of things. But Keely, can you go into a little bit more about that? And would simply universal healthcare fix this crisis that we're having?
Yeah, I mean, just to say, one thing up front, which is that for the vast majority of Americans right now, the way Biden has addressed this phase of the pandemic is it's a remarkable breath of fresh air to millions of Americans who saw just the total criminal mismanagement under the Trump administration. And when it comes to ramping up, vaccine infrastructure and stuff like that, Biden actually is doing some amount, using the Defense Production Act to ramp up the manufacturing capacity, big spending in the stimulus packages in order to give money to the states to ramp up their infrastructures, which have to this point been totally unfunded. And then there's things like stimulus checks, but also like the child care credit, which is, a pretty substantial amount of spending, $3,000 per child to working families. And even all of this, which of course Biden is doing under duress, Biden is doing because of just the immense pressures of the situation, like we've discussed throughout this episode, all these pressures have made it so that, the Democrats, which are a capitalist party, feel that they have no other option but to spend big. But even all of this is still far from enough. And Toya mentioned the question of Medicare for all, or universal health care in the United States. And that's something that there's, been big debates on in the left. How do we force this issue in the context of, democratic control of the federal government? And building a movement to fight for universal healthcare in the U.S. would have a tremendous impact on our ability to have some semblance of, quality public health. And, that's a fight that socialists will be, ferociously engaged in. But even that, as Toya sort of alluded to, even that is still not enough when you have the question of just mass unemployment. What is the rotting corpse of the for-profit healthcare system? Undoing all of that rot requires a really determined approach. You need to take massive insurance companies, big pharma, medical, device manufacturing into public ownership and retool it for social good. Then you also have the question of all of this debt that's accumulated, where, Biden is proposing spending $25 billion in rental assistance, but there's at least $70 billion in unpaid rent in the U.S. And so the $25 billion, maybe helps some people pay their next rent check, but what about all that back rent that people owe? And so in the most jumbled of possible, answers to your question, Toya, no, universal healthcare alone is not a solution to the crisis that we're currently facing. It would be a huge step forward, and maybe even more importantly, winning universal healthcare would give a massive boost of confidence to working people that we can actually struggle for way more than what's on offer from capitalist politicians, and that there's a lot more to win to actually make a real difference, a massive difference, making a decent life for working people in the U.S.
Yeah, thanks for that, Keely. And I totally agree with you that, what Biden has done so far in dealing with the pandemic is a fundamental shift from what we saw previously with Trump. I mean, even just acknowledging the crisis that exists is a huge step forward. And I feel like that's such a low bar that we shouldn't have to say, but it's true. And now we just have a situation where, especially in the US, where you have 50 states plus some odd territories, dealing with this crisis all in their own way. The federal government is giving out vaccines, but not on an equal basis. Then the states have to then decide how they're going to implement the vaccines. And then the cities have to decide how they're then going to implement the vaccines. It's just a crazy, crazy system. So I want to ask Keely for your last question, what then do socialists call for to deal with crises like this, like the COVID pandemic, but also the longer term crisis of the for-profit healthcare system or the pharmaceutical industry that, many people acknowledge is corrupt? That doesn't mean that we say, forget pharmaceuticals, right? We need these types of technologies, but what do socialists call for to deal with these questions?
Yeah, I mean, in the immediate sense, there are a number of things that can be demanded and that can be fought for, even within the confines of a capitalist system. Like we just talked about, universal healthcare. The capitalists could even be forced to a certain degree to rein in big pharmaceutical companies or rein in, the certain commanding heights of the healthcare system. But ultimately, socialists, need to be at in the trenches of a working class movement for these things, making the point that we actually need an entire system overhaul in order to prevent things like this from happening in the future. This isn't the worst or the last pandemic that humanity will ever face. And making sure that the disasters that we've seen over the past 20 years, it feels like 20 years, the past year, making sure that, people don't have to lose years of their life in lockdown and lose people they love and lose their jobs, ensures constructing a completely new society that's democratically planned, where the commanding heights of the entire economy are brought into democratic public control by working class people, where you don't have parasitic profit-driven interests driving the priorities in society. And that's a society that I think a lot of people in the US, consciously or unconsciously, are ready to fight for. And that's quite exciting.
Yeah, I think this is a really, really good point. And I also think that there's so much happening right now. And I think people are, like you said, are ready to fight and are completely aware of all of these problems. So I was wondering, Keishia, what do you think from a perspective of someone who's outside of the US? What do you think what do you think socialists need to do now?
Yeah, well, I think the most obvious things to call for right now would be the free vaccine and abolition of medical patents. Mass testing and tracing programs that are based on the public health systems, not left in the hands of private companies, which we have seen do not do the job up to scratch. And also massive investment into our healthcare systems, of course, for free quality public healthcare, free at the point of use, one-tier health system. And even in, there's research around the world showing that the lack of ICU beds has been responsible for thousands of COVID deaths directly. Medical staff have been forced to triage people, and overwhelmed hospitals that have been treating patients in queues of ambulances in the car park. So obviously, like a massive expansion of the healthcare system, but also that it needs to be brought into democratic public ownership and control with no compensation. Yeah, so in Ireland, there's currently a deal with 18 private hospitals, including those owned by tax cheat and billionaire Larry Goodman, who also owns meat plants, which are rife with COVID and infecting workers. But this deal means that the likes of Larry Goodman and all these other private hospital owners are getting €35.5 million a month, so the public can use 30% of these facilities, and it's completely unacceptable that they would be compensated in a time of emergency. So public health facilities should be taken over with no compensation, and the same with companies that produce vital medical equipment. And in Ireland as well, when one of the leading exporters in the pharmaceutical industry globally employing 30,000 people, and these as well should be directly taken over to produce what is necessary. Like there are whole factories that produce Viagra right now, which is probably not our top priority, And this goes not only for the time in emergencies and times of pandemic, but the health system more generally, that cancer screenings have been missed, procedures have been delayed, and obviously the pandemic has been causing this mental health crisis, which is going to have a big impact for years to come. But in a more general sense as well, we need research into things like rare diseases, which are ignored because they're less profitable, research and treatments into areas of women's health, which are completely neglected because of the kind of systemic sexism in medicine. But as well as just taking this over into public control, it needs the input from workers, because actually it's the workers who know their jobs the best, and it's working class people that are going to make the best decisions about what actually the priorities are in society. And like Keely said, this isn't the last pandemic. And actually, they've been escalating over the last decades with SARS, MERS, bird flu, swine flu. And there is a global partnership that exists in this area that was set up in 2017 called the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. But actually, it wasn't able to do the things that it was supposed to do because it's relying on private investment, because it has all these interests tied up with the capitalist establishment right now, where we need that to be in the interest purely of science and health, and not being tied up in a system that's based on profit.
Yeah, I think these are really, really important points. And I think that the main thing that comes out of this discussion is that we don't only need to be prepared, but we also need to take away the motives that the system puts at the head of things. And we need to put the lives of regular, ordinary people at the top, which is absolutely ridiculous that we even need to say this. We are in a crisis, and still we see the profit being the most important thing. And I think even when we talk about the vaccines, we still see that. So I really want to thank you both, Keely and Keishia. I think this was really, really interesting and really educational. And I think it's just, if you're watching this and you're not ready to fight those companies now, I don't know what else you need, really. So thank you so much.
This has been a great episode, and now it's time for the shout out of the week. We are shouting out the Chicago branch of Socialist Alternative in the US and the role that they've been playing organizing teachers in the Chicago Teachers Union, which is one of the largest unions in the city. They're a real badass union. They're always fighting. And so now they have been fighting on the question of reopening schools. I mean, this question itself has been polarizing society for almost a year now. Are they going to open up the schools? Can children transfer the virus? Are teachers going to be the first to get the vaccine? Are they considered essential workers? And then also the questions of the effects, the long-term effects of remote learning, children's access to internet, who is going to be watching them. And, you know, the millions of teachers, maybe thousands of teachers who have left teaching because of all this. I mean, there's just so many issues that have been brought up around this question. And the Chicago teachers have been fighting for years, actually, over the question of school funding, standardized testing, school closures, contract battles. And so this time around, when they were organizing for the tentative agreement for their new contract and whether they would be reopening the schools, we saw teachers across the city start doing remote learning outside. In Chicago right now in February, it is freezing. So you saw pictures of teachers and videos of teachers sitting on benches, bundled up, just so that way they didn't have to go back in the building and expose themselves, but they still wanted to be there teaching for their students. It was absolutely inspirational. And you know, one aspect of teaching alongside with things like nursing is as a worker, teachers and nurses alike are forced to put their needs on the back burner for the needs of their students, for the needs of their patients. And what ends up happening is that these effects then, you know, ruin the quality of care that they're able to give. And so, you know, shout out to the Chicago branch of Socialist Alternative. We also have 3 Chicago teachers who were organizing in this. They did vote to approve the tentative agreement 2-1, but that doesn't mean that the battle ends here. You know, this has shown in our society that the question of childcare is hugely important, and the burden should not just be left on parents. It should not just be left on teachers. This pandemic has taught us that our economic policies and our budgets need to include things like childcare. So I want to show you a clip of some of the teachers that have organized in Socialist Alternative in Chicago.
Hello, my name is Melissa Vozar, and I am a teacher and a CTU member and a member of Socialist Alternative. CTU members have until the end of Tuesday, February 9th, to vote on Lori Lightfoot's reckless school reopening plan. Socialist Alternative educators and parents have joined in the struggle for a safe reopening since the beginning. We are urging members to vote no on Lightfoot's dangerous plan. Do not believe the corporate media. The fight is not over. The CTU House of Delegates did not vote to pass a tentative agreement. The vote was to have members decide. We have the power, and we should vote no and get organized. Vote no and get organized for a safe reopening. To safely reopen and meet the needs of students, educators, and parents, we must stay remote for Q3 and use that time to improve remote learning for the 80% of students that are staying remote. Vote no and get organized. Educators need access to 2 shots of the vaccine before we go back, and a return to remote learning when the citywide positivity rate is 3%, not CPS's unscientific metric. Vote no and get organized. Because members are being retaliated against, they need our support. An injury to one is an injury to all. Vote no and get organized, because this is about the needs of the wider community. Working parents need income support, rent abatements, and high-quality, municipally owned broadband. Vote no and get organized, because we need to stand up to big business and Lori Lightfoot's bullying tactics. Let's be clear, we're under massive pressure from the White House to reopen. Their plan is just not safe. National leaders like Randy Weingarten are going along with this, and CTU should not. We need to stay strong and united for a safe reopening. Our fight will be watched around the country and even around the world. If we win, we can set a model for safe reopenings. Go back to your schools, organize meetings, and campaign for a no vote. We need to send a strong vote back to our union leadership that we are confident and strike action. The struggle has been led at every stage by bold rank and file action and innovative tactics. If we fight, we can win. Vote no. Get organized. Solidarity.
So I want to thank everyone who tuned in to watch us today. Make sure you subscribe to our channel, like this video, throw in a comment or two, and invite people to watch our show next week. We'll be here same time, same place. Bye.
This is World to Win. Every Sunday, we broadcast with speakers from across the globe, bringing you the latest news and analysis on the fast-moving global events from a socialist perspective.